The air inside the obsidian room was so thick with tension you could almost taste the iron. In this sanctuary for New York's most lethal shadows, silence wasn't just a rule, it was a survival tactic. Usually, the only sound you'd hear was the soft pour of $1,000 vintage, but tonight, the silence was shattered. Every eye in the room was fixed on the center table, the throne of Marco Valenti. He was the ghost of Sicily, a man who could erase a person's entire existence with a single text message. But right now, the most powerful man in the city looked paralyzed. His 7-year-old daughter, Luna, was mid-meltdown. Her screams were raw, jagged, and terrified, echoing off the marble walls like a siren. Beside her, the elite guards, including the cold-eyed Victor Hale, stood like statues, their hands hovering near their holsters, unsure of how to kill a tantrum. Nannies had been fired by the dozen. Specialists had given up. Then, she appeared. A waitress in a crisp white uniform that didn't quite hide the exhaustion in her posture. Elena Rossi didn't look like a savior. She looked like a ghost, someone who had lost her home, her name, and her future. While the rest of the staff cowered in the kitchen, Elena walked straight into the kill zone. She didn't flinch at the guards. She didn't tremble under Marco's icy stare. She simply leaned down and whispered 5 specific words into the little girl's ear. In an instant, the screaming stopped. The silence returned, but this time, it was different. Marco Valenti didn't reach for his glass, he froze, staring at the homeless waitress as if she held the keys to his soul. But Elena was hiding a secret. A secret buried in the very empire Marco Valenti sat upon, a secret that could either burn the city down or save them both. If you're ready for a story of forbidden ties, high-stakes revenge, and a love that grows in the dark, hit that like button and subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens when the ghost finally meets his match. But before we find out those 5 life-changing words, we have to go back to 6 o'clock that evening, when Elena Rossi was just another invisible girl trying to survive one more night on the streets. The heavy iron door of the industrial freezer hummed, a low, vibrating drone that usually masked the sound of Elena's heavy breathing. It was 6 hours before the dinner rush at the Obsidian Room, the only time of day when the air didn't smell like expensive cigars and desperation. Elena Rossi adjusted her crisp white apron, the starch scratching against her neck, and ducked into the narrow dry storage pantry. Behind a tower of imported flour sacks and crates of vintage wine sat a small, battered suitcase and a sleeping bag tucked into the shadows. This was home. Or at least, the closest thing Elena had to one since the day her legal existence had been deleted from every server in the city. To the world, Elena Rossi was a ghost. To the IRS, she didn't exist. But to the shivering 10-year-old girl huddled in the corner of the pantry, she was everything. "Mia, keep your voice down," Elena whispered, her voice cracking with the strain of a woman who had spent 18 hours on her feet. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a slightly bruised apple and a dinner roll she'd managed to scavenge from a busboy's tray. Mia's small, pale hands snatched the bread. The child's eyes were too large for her face, dark mirrors of the trauma they had shared when their front door was kicked in 6 months ago. "Are we staying here tonight too, Elle?" "Just a little longer," Elena lied, the weight of the falsehood settling in her chest like lead. She brushed a stray hair from her sister's forehead, her fingers trembling. "I have the late shift tonight. There's a big table, table 1. The tips could be enough to get us into that hostel in Queens." She didn't tell Mia that table 1 belonged to Marco Valenti. She didn't tell her that the men who frequented this club were the same brand of monsters who had signed the papers to liquidate their lives. Elena lived in a state of constant, low-grade terror, knowing that if the manager, Mr. Ricci, found her sister in the pantry, they wouldn't just be fired, they would be erased. Elena stood up, smoothing the wrinkles in her white uniform. She looked in a small, cracked hand mirror, wiped the smudge of charcoal from her cheek, and practiced her invisible face. She had to be a shadow, present enough to serve, but silent enough to be forgotten. She was a homeless girl playing a dangerous game of dress-up in a den of lions, but as she looked at Mia's hollow cheeks, Elena knew she would walk through fire to keep that pantry door locked. She stepped out into the gilded hallway, the transition from the dark, cramped storage to the blinding gold leaf of the dining room jarring her senses. The hunt was beginning. The transition from the cold pantry to the plush carpets of the restaurant always triggered the phantom itch of a memory Elena tried to bury, the smell of expensive cologne and the sterile click of a high-end office door. 18 months ago, she hadn't been a ghost in a white apron, she had been a rising star at Sterling Financial, a senior auditor with a corner office and a future that felt untouchable. It happened on a Tuesday, a day that began with a steaming cup of espresso and ended with her life being systematically dismantled. Elena had found the black hole, a series of offshore accounts disguised as charitable trusts. They weren't just moving money, they were washing it, millions of dollars flowing like digital blood through the accounts of names she wasn't supposed to know. She had taken the file to her mentor, a man she trusted like a father. He had looked at the data, sighed with a pity that chilled her bones, and told her to go home early. By the time she reached her apartment, her keycard didn't work. The electronic lock glowed a mocking, defiant red. Elena had pulled out her phone to call the building manager, only to find the screen flashing a "service suspended" alert. Within an hour, her credit cards were declined at the grocery store. Within 3, her bank account, the one holding the savings for Mia's education, showed a balance of 0, flagged for fraudulent activity. The corporate execution was bloodless but total. In the eyes of the law, Elena Rossi had become a non-entity. Her social security number was flagged, her digital footprint scrubbed, and a burn notice was sent to every reputable firm in the city. She wasn't just fired, she was erased. When she tried to go to the police, she found a dark sedan parked outside the precinct. A man with a jaw like granite had rolled down the window, his eyes hidden behind dark lenses, and whispered a warning that haunted her dreams: "A ghost shouldn't make noise, Elena. If you speak, your sister becomes a ghost too." She had watched from across the street as men in black suits hauled her furniture into a dumpster, her childhood photos scattered in the gutter like trash. They had taken her home, her pride, and her safety, leaving her with nothing but a sleeping sister and the realization that the world she lived in was built on a foundation of monsters. Now, as she adjusted the tray on her shoulder in the present day, Elena felt that same chill. The man responsible for the black hole had never been caught, but the signature on those offshore accounts was a name she saw every night on the reservation list: Valenti. Every plate she served was a step closer to the fire, but it was the only way to keep the shadows from swallowing Mia whole. Marco Valenti sat in the back of his armored sedan, the city lights blurring into long, jagged streaks of neon against the reinforced glass. To the 5 families, he was the ghost of Sicily, a man who spoke in whispers and acted with the surgical precision of a reaper. He was the strategist, the one who could find the fracture point in any empire and shatter it with a single push. But as he glanced at the small, rigid figure sitting on the leather seat beside him, Marco felt like the one who was breaking. Luna hadn't spoken since they left the penthouse. She clutched her worn stuffed lamb as if it were a shield, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the floor mats. Since her mother's accident, a year ago, the child had become a hollow shell, prone to sudden, violent storms of grief that no doctor could soothe and no amount of money could silence. Marco adjusted his cufflinks, the gold glinting in the dim interior light. He was a man who demanded absolute order, yet his own blood was a chaos he couldn't govern. Every time Luna screamed, it felt like a public indictment of his failure. His enemies were watching, waiting for a crack in the ghost's armor. A man who couldn't control his own household was a man who could be toppled. He knew the whispers in the dark corners of the obsidian room. They said the ghost was getting soft, distracted by a broken child. "Luna," he said, his voice dropping to that low, vibrating frequency that made grown men tremble. "We are dining with the associates tonight. I need you to be the brave girl I know you are." The child didn't look up. A single tear tracked through the dust on her cheek. Marco felt a sharp, unfamiliar pang in his chest, not of anger, but of a terrifying, suffocating helplessness. He could order a hit, fix a market, or bribe a senator, but he couldn't reach the daughter sitting 3 feet away from him. He was the architect of a $1 million criminal machine, yet he was drowning in the silence of a 7-year-old. As the car pulled up to the curb of the restaurant, Victor Hale opened the door, his expression as unreadable as a tombstone. Marco stepped out, the cold air hitting his face, and reached back for Luna's hand. She recoiled, a small, involuntary flinch that cut deeper than any blade. He straightened his suit, the mask of the ruthless boss sliding back into place, even as his heart hammered against his ribs. He was walking into a room full of predators, carrying his greatest weakness in plain sight. He just didn't know that tonight, the ghost wouldn't be the one in control. The golden luster of the obsidian room felt like a fever dream as Elena walked through the rain-slicked labyrinth of the industrial district toward the derelict tenement she called home. The shift had ended in a blur of adrenaline and terror. She could still feel the vibration of Luna's final scream in her marrow and the weight of Marco Valenti's eyes on her back as she had slipped away into the night. She had done the impossible, quieted the storm, but in the world of the Valenti Empire, no good deed went unpunished. She found Mia asleep in their makeshift corner, the girls breathing heavy with the onset of a chest cold. Elena was just tucking a threadbare blanket around her sister's shoulders when a low, rhythmic thrumming vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't the sound of the subway. It was the idle of a high-performance engine. A sudden, sharp beam of LED headlights cut through the grime of their single window, illuminating the peeling wallpaper like a searchlight. Elena stood, her heart hammering against her ribs, and reached for a heavy iron pipe she kept hidden behind the radiator. Before she could even grip it, the door, bolted with 3 separate locks she'd installed herself, groaned under a controlled, immense pressure. It didn't burst open, it was opened with a key. Victor Hale stepped into the shadows of the room, his presence instantly making the cramped space feel suffocating. He looked entirely out of place in his bespoke suit against the backdrop of water-stained walls and a flickering bare bulb. His eyes, cold and analytical, scanned the room, lingering on the small, shivering girl in the bed before landing on Elena. He didn't look like a man here to offer a promotion, he looked like a reaper settling a debt. "Mr. Valenti doesn't like to wait," Victor said, his voice a flat, emotionless rasp. "I'm not for sale, and I don't work private shifts," Elena shot back, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. She stepped in front of Mia, shielding her from his gaze. Victor didn't move, but the air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a slim, black leather folder. He tossed it onto the rickety wooden table. "That's the Rossi file. The legal erasure of your name, your bank accounts, and your sister's medical records. It took our specialists 20 minutes to find the encryption key your former employers used to bury you." Elena's breath hitched. She stared at the folder as if it were a live serpent. "You did something tonight no one else could," Victor continued, his hand resting casually on the lapel of his jacket, just inches from his weapon. "The boss wants to know why. And the child hasn't stopped asking for the woman in white. You can stay here and disappear into the mold of these walls, or you can come with me and get your life back." Elena looked at the folder, then at Mia's pale face. She knew this wasn't an invitation, it was a summoning. By soothing the daughter of a monster, she had stepped out of the shadows and into the crosshairs of a throne. She reached for her coat, the white apron of the restaurant still balled up in her bag, a shroud she was about to put back on. "Don't wake her," Elena whispered, stepping toward the door. "If I'm going into the lion's den, I'm going on my own terms." The Valenti estate was a fortress of limestone and iron, perched high above the city like a gargoyle watching over its kingdom. As the heavy gates hummed shut behind Victor's black sedan, Elena felt the weight of the air change. Inside, the manor was a tomb of silent luxury, hushed marble halls, velvet curtains that swallowed the moonlight, and the oppressive scent of beeswax and old money. It was a golden cage designed to keep the world out, but as Elena was led toward the nursery, she realized it was also designed to keep a terrible darkness in. She found Luna in a room that looked more like a museum than a child's sanctuary. Thousands of dollars of toys sat untouched on white lacquer shelves, their glass eyes staring blankly. The girl was huddled in the center of an expansive canopy bed, her small frame dwarfed by the opulence. When she saw Elena, she didn't cry or scream, she simply reached out a trembling hand, her fingers curling into the fabric of Elena's white sleeve as if it were a lifeline. "You came back," Luna whispered, her voice a fragile thread. Elena sat on the edge of the mattress, the silence of the house pressing against her ears. At the restaurant, the 5 words had been a simple anchor, "You are safe with me." But as she looked into Luna's haunted eyes, Elena realized the child wasn't suffering from a simple tantrum or a spoiled heart. There was a frantic, darting look in Luna's gaze, the way she kept glancing at the heavy oak wardrobe in the corner, her breathing hitching every time the floorboards groaned. "I promised I would," Elena said softly, smoothing the girl's hair. As Luna drifted into a fitful sleep, her tiny hand never letting go, she began to mumble, words born from the fever of a recurring nightmare. "The man in the wall, he has the red key. Don't let him take the papers, Daddy." Elena froze. Her mind raced back to the corporate files she had audited, the black hole accounts that had led to her own ruin. The phrase "the red key" wasn't a child's fantasy, it was the name of the high-level encryption software used by Sterling Financial to hide the Valenti family's laundered millions. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Luna wasn't just a grieving daughter, she was a witness. She had seen something she wasn't supposed to see, a secret that had likely cost her mother her life and Elena her identity. The 5 words had gained her entry into this palace, but they had also trapped her inside a conspiracy far deadlier than a Mafia turf war. Looking up, Elena saw Victor Hale standing in the shadow of the doorway, his eyes unblinking, watching her realize that she had just traded her invisibility for a seat at the center of a bloodbath. The scent of expensive tobacco and rain-dampened wool preceded him before he even stepped into the nursery's soft glow. Marco Valenti stood in the doorway, his silhouette cutting a sharp, intimidating figure against the dim hallway light. He had removed his jacket, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension and a complex web of tattoos that spoke of a history written in violence. For a moment, he simply watched Elena as she sat by his daughter's bed, the girl's hand still anchored to Elena's wrist. The ghost of Sicily didn't look like a reaper now, he looked like a man who was starving for a piece he couldn't buy. He crossed the room with a predator's grace, but his footsteps were silent, careful not to break the fragile sleep Elena had fought to secure. He stopped just inches away, the heat radiating from him cutting through the room's artificial chill. "She hasn't slept through the night in 4 months, Marco said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate in the small space between them. He didn't look at Elena, his gaze was fixed on Luna's peaceful face. "What did you say to her? At the restaurant?" Elena looked up, meeting his eyes. Up close, the ice in his gaze had melted into something darker, a depth of exhaustion that mirrored her own. "I told her she didn't have to be perfect to be loved," Elena whispered. "And that the world is loud, but my voice would be the only one she had to follow." Marco's gaze shifted to Elena, dropping to the pulse point at her throat before locking onto her eyes. The air between them thickened, charged with a sudden, dangerous electricity. It wasn't just the gratitude of a father, it was the recognition of 2 survivors who had both been forged in the dark. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face as if he meant to brush away a stray hair, but he stopped himself, his fingers curling into a fist. "You're a waitress with the soul of a queen and the eyes of a soldier, Elena Rossi," he murmured, his voice dropping an octave. "Why do I feel like you're the most dangerous thing that's ever entered this house?" "Because you know I have nothing left to lose," she replied, her heart hammering against her ribs. For a heartbeat, the mask of the Mafia boss slipped entirely. He leaned in, his breath warm against her skin, and for the first time, Elena didn't see the monster who had signed the papers to erase her life. She saw a man trapped in a prison of his own making. The spark of attraction was a jagged, painful thing, a bridge built over an abyss of secrets. He pulled back just as quickly, the cold iron of his reputation sliding back into place, but the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was a promise of a storm yet to come. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind Marco, leaving the room in a silence that felt far from empty. Elena remained by the bedside, her heart still racing from the proximity of a man she was supposed to fear. But as she adjusted the blanket over Luna, the prickle of eyes on her neck returned, colder and sharper than Marco's heat. She turned slowly. Victor Hale was standing in the shadows of the nursery's foyer, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the hallway. He hadn't left with his boss. He stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back, but his posture lacked the respectful deference of a bodyguard. There was a rigid, predatory stillness to him, the way a viper waits for a mouse to stray too far from its hole. "You're playing a dangerous game, Elena," Victor said. His voice was a flat, metallic rasp that stripped the warmth from the room. He stepped forward, the light hitting his face just enough to reveal eyes that were devoid of the weariness she had seen in Marco's. Victor's eyes were hungry. Elena stood her ground, her fingers curling into the fabric of her apron. "I'm doing my job. The job I was brought here to do. Is that what you call it?" Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes, it was merely a baring of teeth. He moved closer, circling her with a slow, deliberate pace that forced her to pivot to keep him in sight. "Most people who enter this house want money. Some want power. But you look at the boss like you're trying to find a heartbeat, and you look at the files like you're looking for a weapon." Elena's blood turned to ice. She realized then that while Marco was blinded by his daughter's peace, Victor was blinded by nothing. He wasn't just protective of the Valenti Empire, he was watching for any crack he could exploit. She noticed the way his gaze darted to the wardrobe Luna had been mumbling about, the one with the man in the wall. "I know your type," Victor whispered, leaning in so close she could smell the sterile scent of gun oil and peppermint. "You think because you saved the girl, you're untouchable. But the ghost isn't the only one who can make people disappear. I've spent 10 years cleaning up the messes made by sentimental fools." He reached out, not to touch her, but to pluck a stray thread from her white sleeve. The movement was a threat, a demonstration of how easily he could reach her throat. Elena saw the flicker of something beyond duty in his expression, a deep-seated resentment, a silent ambition that made him far more dangerous than the man who paid his salary. "Sleep well, Elena Rossi," he said, backing into the shadows. "But remember, I don't just notice everything. I remember everything. And the moment you trip, I'll be the one to catch you." As he vanished into the hallway, Elena realized the true layout of the board. She wasn't just a guest in a Mafia manor, she was caught between a boss who was rediscovering his humanity and a traitor who had long ago traded his away. If she was going to save Mia and herself, she had to find that red key before Victor Hale used it to unlock her grave. The stillness of the manor after midnight was deceptive. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a home, but the heavy, expectant silence of a tomb. Elena slipped from the nursery, her footsteps light as a heartbeat on the thick Persian runners. She knew she had a window of 20 minutes while the security detail rotated at the perimeter. Victor was a creature of habit, and his obsession with perfection was the only flaw she could exploit. The heavy mahogany doors of Marco's private study yielded with a soft click. The room smelled of old paper, cedar, and the ghost of the man who had sat there hours before. Elena didn't go for the obvious drawers, she went for the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Her fingers traced the spines until she found a slight misalignment in a row of leather-bound ledgers. With a gentle pull, a section of the wall receded, revealing a sleek, modern safe, the digital heart of the Valenti Empire. Her hands trembled as she keyed in the sequence. She hadn't guessed it, she had watched the reflection in the window glass earlier that evening while Marco had his back turned. The safe side open, and the first thing she saw wasn't gold or cash. It was a thick, manila folder labeled with a name that made the world tilt, Rossi, E. She pulled it out, her breath catching in her throat. Inside was every piece of her stolen life. Her original social security card, the deed to her parents' house, and the black hole audit files she had discovered at Sterling Financial. But as she flipped through the pages, a cold realization replaced her fear. The signature on the internal memo authorizing her erasure wasn't Marco's. It was the same jagged, aggressive script she had seen on Victor Hale's requisition forms. Then she found the final page, a wire transfer for $80,000, the exact amount of her stolen savings, sent to an offshore account. The recipient's alias was a name she recognized from her corporate days, but the authorizing signature at the bottom was M. Valenti. Elena dropped the file, the paper scattering across the floor like autumn leaves. A crushing weight settled in her chest. Had Marco been the one to authorize her destruction, or was he merely the man who had bought the pieces of her life after Victor broke them? That dark romance she had felt sparking in the nursery felt like a cruel joke. She was a moth who had fallen in love with the flame that had already burned her wings to ash. The sound of a heavy footstep in the hallway snapped her back to reality. The shadow of a man appeared against the frosted glass of the study door. Elena realized with a jolt of terror that the secret she had come to find was far more complicated than a simple revenge story. She wasn't just a waitress or a caretaker, she was the missing piece of a puzzle that both Marco and Victor were willing to kill for. She scrambled to gather the papers, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, knowing that if the door opened now, she wouldn't just be a ghost, she would be a memory. The study door didn't swing open, it exploded inward. Elena had only seconds to shove the Rossi file into the waistband of her trousers before the room was flooded with the sharp, rhythmic glare of crimson emergency lights. The silence of the manor was replaced by the deafening roar of a tactical breach. The girl. Secure the girl, a voice barked, not Marco's, but Victor's. Elena didn't think, she moved with the desperate agility of someone who had already lost everything once. She scrambled through the connecting servants' passage, reaching the nursery just as a masked figure shattered the balcony glass. Luna was upright in bed, her mouth open in a silent, paralyzed scream. Victor Hale was already there, but he wasn't shielding the child. He was reaching for the red lacquered jewelry box on the nightstand, the red key Luna had whispered about. Victor, stop! Elena shouted, throwing herself between the assassin and the bed. Victor turned, his face a mask of cold, calculated treason. You should have stayed a ghost, Elena. You're a loose thread in $1 million tapestry. He raised his suppressed weapon, but a sudden, heavy shadow collided with him. Marco Valenti had arrived. He fought with a primal, jagged fury, his suit jacket discarded, his white shirt stained with the soot of the explosion. As the two men grappled, Elena grabbed Luna and pulled her under the heavy oak desk, shielding the child's body with her own. Look at me, Luna. Elena commanded over the chaos. The 5 words. Remember. You are safe with me. The child's eyes locked onto Elena's, and the panic that had fueled her tantrums for months suddenly coalesced into a sharp, crystalline focus. Luna reached into her stuffed lamb's torn seam and pulled out a small, red USB drive. She pressed it into Elena's palm. It wasn't in a wardrobe or a wall, it was in the only thing the child loved. The fight ended with a sickening thud as Marco pinned Victor against the marble fireplace. Why? Marco rasped, his hand tightening around Victor's throat. Because you became weak, Victor spat, blood blooming across his teeth. You let a waitress and a crying brat compromise the empire. Elena stepped out from the shadows, her hand trembling as she held up the red drive. He didn't just want your empire, Marco. He stole my life to hide the fact that he was the one draining your accounts. It's all here. The Rossi file, the wire transfers, the murder of Luna's mother. It wasn't an accident. It was a takeover. The silence that followed was absolute. Marco looked at the drive, then at Elena, the woman in white who had walked into his house of shadows and found the light. He didn't look at Victor again as he signaled his loyal men to drag the traitor away. When the sun began to bleed over the New York skyline, that ghost was gone. In his place was a man sitting on the mansion steps, his daughter asleep in his lap and Elena Rossi by his side. She was no longer a waitress, and she was no longer homeless. She was the woman who had played the Queen's Gambit and won back her soul. As Marco took her hand, his thumb tracing the scars of her hard labor, Elena knew the 5 words had changed more than just a child's heart. They had built a new empire from the ashes of the old. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. We wish you and your family strength, a life full of joy and peace every day. See you again in the next video.